Okay, hi everyone. I think we can get started. Hi, my name's Sophie Tolkoff, and I'm on the acquisitions team in the Goldman Sachs Merchant Banking Division Real Estate Group. As someone who is very engaged and passionate about the real estate technology sector and a longtime follower of CREtech, I'm proud to be serving as the MC for today's webinar. Having guest MCs like myself is another terrific way the CREtech team is supporting and encouraging the next generation of real estate tech leaders. To touch on a few upcoming events, on July 27th through the 30th, join CREtech and Future PropTech for the Reimagining Real Estate Global Virtual Summit, a 4-day, completely free global virtual summit that will feature the leading owners, landlords, investors, asset managers, brokers, and technology leaders discussing how they are reimagining real estate during the pandemic. And don't miss the virtual demo days on September 15th and October 27th, where you can experience live demos from the most innovative tech companies in commercial real estate. Virtual Demo Day is the best way to discover startups that you need to know about without leaving your desk. Plus, it's free. Now to today's webinar. CREtech is proud to introduce their webinar series focused on its global innovation consulting practice. Each month, CREtech will take a deep dive on an important trend in the world of real estate technology and innovation. These themes are carefully selected and researched by their world-class team of consultants and advisors. In the first CREtech Consulting Talks webinar, we will take a look at which technologies have emerged from the pandemic as must-haves for landlords and brokerages. As a result of the pandemic, real estate companies have been forced to adopt technology with a greater sense of urgency than at any time in history. Today, we're going to hear from several of the world-class consultants and advisors as they discuss which technologies move to the forefront of real estate tech adoption. Today's speakers are Frank Spadafora, Marcio DaCosta, Lee Odess, all consultants for CREtech, and Khushbu Sikaria, who sits on the CREtech Advisory Board. And today's moderator will be Minta Kay from Goodwin. With that, I'll pass it over to Minta.
Thank you very much, Sophie. We're all looking forward to talking with you today about ways in which the impact of technology on the use and shape of real estate is accelerating. And it's something that the group assembled today feels should be considered in the context of long-term real estate value creation, value preservation, and community building. So, we're coming at this from a perspective to talk to real estate owners, investors, and developers about how to get their head around technology in their businesses. Today we're going to talk about 4 things, although we may diverge, who knows, we'll see where the conversation goes, and we'll see where the interest of the audience is. But we're going to talk about tech evolution. We are going to talk about data strategies and the potential impact they can have on the real estate industry participant sector. We're going to talk about forward-looking design, and we'll talk about actual deployment of long-term value add solutions around technology, as opposed to just short-term solutions that people feel they need to adopt to address, the Our panelists will share their views on the importance of developing strategy around real estate technology and around long-term design. And I think those are both go hand in hand, although they have different aspects to them, but I think that will be very interesting for you all to hear. Some groups want to adopt tech, some don't, but therein lies the quandary that each institution will figure out on its own. Many of the forward-thinking real estate leaders have moved on from actual technology deployment to thinking about new design and shape. And we have participants who can speak to that and are very deep and involved in thinking about what our communities of the future will look like. I think it goes without saying that there's a tremendous amount of content on the web right now, some highly technical, some highly visual. Owners and operators are publishing their return to work, return to open procedures. Architectural firms are putting out new thoughts around design, all very, very exciting. least to me, but all potentially very difficult to wade through. So the massive amount of information, I think, has created an opportunity that CREtech saw. And they saw an opportunity to be helpful to the real estate community by bringing together teams of world-class experts that can assess information, pick it apart, develop strategy, and really talk with real estate industry clients and communities around what it is that they want to achieve and what their particular pain points and business goals are. So, that's what CREtech is doing. It's done that, and I am very, very honored to have been invited to join the advisory board and also to moderate this first CREtech Consulting Talks webinar. We hope that you enjoy it. We hope that you find it informative. We have more to cover in an hour than we ever could, so I would expect that this will be followed on by more in-depth dives in certain areas that we're going to touch upon. But with that, you have a general scope of what we're going to cover, and I'd like to kick our conversation off to Marcio, who's got some very well-developed thoughts about a way to get a handle on technology and a way to get out of the analysis paralysis around what one should or should not do.
Thank you, Mika. I just wanted to check that you guys can hear me okay.
Yep.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually today. And just a good way to kind of try to draw some boundaries here, because for the most part, all of you have been looking at different technologies and different things that are coming very rapidly. And so one of the ways that CREtech likes to kind of organize this information is to look at the hype versus reality of these technologies. And it helps us to draw some focus on the things that are more near term and advantageous, and potentially we can actually start to take advantage and get some value, versus things that are kind of still in the works and potentially, while they may be, there's a lot of conversation around, there's a lot of articles. I always like to use the blockchain example, certainly a lot of hype around that, but when you try to look at those technologies and get a sense of what does it actually do for commercial real estate, it's very difficult to tell that yet. Ultimately, we know that that's a technology that will potentially have dramatic impact on the industry, but for now it remains a little bit elusive. And so the way to kind of look at this chart is the things to the left are still fairly immature and require a little bit more development before we can actually start to really use them. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are things that can't be valuable today. It just means that you're likely to be finding version 1 or even a beta version of that product, versus the things towards the right, which have gone through the inflated expectations, have now kind of been processed, and there's typically this disillusionment that happens, and then it peaks back up in terms of, okay, now we're starting to realize what this thing can actually do. But towards the left, it's very often it's kind of like it slices, it dices, it does everything, but frankly, when you actually try it, it doesn't quite live up to those expectations for the most part. So, I'll draw your attention to the right. Those are the things like IoT, for example, where you're now looking at version 2, 3 of those products. So all the sensor technologies and so forth. And we took it one step further to kind of, obviously with COVID front of mind for everybody, we kind of thought, it might be helpful to highlight the ones that we are seeing potentially have some benefit towards fighting the pandemic. So sanitization technologies like UVC lighting and electrostatic sprayers and the like, they're just kind of, they've been around, but I think you now are starting to see this explosion in that area. And so we kind of put it at the top of that list where there's quite a lot of expectations, but ultimately I think we need to settle on what those things can actually do. And then, following that same path, autonomous workplace robots, those have been around now for a little bit, but we are starting to see quite a bit there in terms of potentially combined with sanitization technologies to be able to disinfect areas and so forth. Tenant experience has been around for a while. I think we're looking at ways in which we can communicate better with tenants and inform them what's going on. That's going to be, communications are going to be extremely important, you know, in the midst of a pandemic. And then all the IoT sensors and geospatial location intelligence, those are things that clearly will give you very useful data in terms of occupancy sensors. They could tell you which areas are being used, air quality controls and sensors, you know, where people are moving, those kinds of sensors and data points that will help to make more informed decisions, both for occupiers and asset managers and so forth, to figure out, you know, where they might direct cleaning, where they might need some additional attention, those kinds of things. So a lot here to cover, but, you know, again, just to give you a sense of where things are and where the near-term opportunities are. So certainly the IoT side, more advanced, readily available. And then, you know, and then obviously keeping an eye on some of the other things that are coming and beginning those early experimentations. Like I would always highlight digital twin as one that is pretty important to our industry ultimately, but needs a little bit more maturity. So hopefully this is helpful to kind of set the stage of where we're at, and we like to update this regularly because obviously this is a moving target. So we'll continue to move these things around as we get to evaluate these technologies and work with different clients on where they're at.
Thanks, Marcio. I think that's a perfect segue into asking Frank to comment on, you know, what his thoughts are around deployment of this technology with respect to particular assets and portfolios. You know, Frank's done a lot of thinking about data analysis and the importance of data. Many of the items that you have identified, particularly on the mature IoT side, are, you know, peer gathering technologies, et cetera. So Frank, I'll tip it to you and ask you to share your thoughts as an expert in this area around the way you advise clients to deal with data.
Thank you, Minta, and I'm honored to be part of this world-class leadership team today, so I appreciate the opportunity. You know, I think whenever I'm asked about future-proofing real estate, it always comes back to me to an underpinning of a data strategy, because I think it's foundational to everything we're doing from deployment of point solutions. So if you look at the COVID crisis and you look at occupancy density monitoring, touchless access controls, you know, within the built environment, data is driving all of that from a planning standard operating procedure standpoint, even to preventative and proactive when you look at sanitation and cleaning within a space. So I'd like to look at data more generally, because I do think it truly is the foundation on the emerging tech side for adoption and acceleration. So when we think about innovation in the built environment, particularly in respect to COVID and developing a go-forward strategy, I think we often look at property technology in relation to connected buildings, you know, to the built world, the physical space. Point solutions from tech advancements like touchless access controls, which we've mentioned, unified tenant communication, occupancy density monitoring, even robotic sanitation. These are all new tools in the toolkit for the built world. But the one thing that we often don't hear as much about, I think, is the advancements of data and analytics generally, and that is really a foundational capability. I think that that's fundamental when we talk about the concept of managing the pandemic, identifying and managing risk within, you know, the current situation, and even opportunity post-pandemic. So I think that a data strategy is an imperative for every organization, regardless of your level of sophistication. And I don't know that we often talk right now about the point solutions, but not really as much about, I think, the underlying advancements in data and data management. So look, let's face the facts. Our industry continues to make the case for and iterative developments and advancements towards unified data standards, greater transparency, and reduced friction in applying data to support decision making. But the ecosystem around CRE data is still fragmented. I'd even go as far as to propose that some of the major acquisitions and assemblages we've seen over the last couple of years from some of the major solution providers is actually it's further ingraining that fragmentation, right? Because you have a lot of pseudo standards, you have a lot of end-to-end workflow where now you have self-contained ecosystems around data. So I don't know that we've gotten any further towards the standards, but I do think there are some practical applications that owners, investors, occupiers can take to utilize, to build a data strategy and utilize that to take advantage of the emerging technology. So I'd like to, to speak to just some basic recommendations. So where do you start, right? Creating contextual and actionable insight using CRE data requires the ability to synthesize data, right, across that our ecosystem of fragmentation, join multiple heterogeneous data sets, geospatial capabilities to overlay those data sets and visualize patterns, and even statistical tools so we can discover and apply hidden demand drivers that correlate to value. So where do you start? I think there are 8 basic principles that we could advise clients on for taking this journey, for preparing for their own data strategy and how they can utilize that to accelerate technology. So I'm going to cycle through those very quickly, talk about a few examples. Please feel free, anyone on the panel, to interject. I think the first foundational step is defining and developing your data taxonomy. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a basic set of data, there's a wide universe of data, and that's increasing exponentially. When we talk about sentiment data and mobility data and the built environment, there's more data than we've ever had to contend with within CRE. So what data is critical to you? You really need to determine that based on 3 things, I think: your operations, compliance and risk management, and the questions that you want to answer about your portfolio to future-proof it. If you start there, this actually gives you a foundation to determine what data is critical to track, right? It also ensures that downstream you'll be able to take advantage of those emerging multi-dimensional analysis tools that we have, whether it's geospatial analysis, machine learning. So let me give you a prime example. If I'm a regional multifamily operator, from an operations and risk standpoint, I want to understand if I'm collecting tenant data and any personally identifiable information, PII. It's critical to know that, because how I store it, how I protect data privacy around it, those are all important considerations. But if you don't understand the data you're tracking, you won't even know that you're collecting it. In that same example, let's say that I operate these multifamily, this portfolio, and I want to be able to benchmark it against some of the emerging technology that gives me OpEx benchmarking, because that's now out there in the space when we talk about emerging providers. I need to understand how I track my chart of accounts, what solutions I use to manage my P&L, right? And that's going to be really important to make sure that I can join and map to other benchmark data sets downstream. Otherwise, the friction and the overhead to benefit from those technologies are going to be constrained. So point number 1 is really—
I think that, yeah, it's an important point. There is a lot of data to be gathered for folks in the audience, as they all too well know, and mining it and pulling it together in a way that's actually useful and manageable from the day-to-day perspective of running buildings, running assets, whatever type they may be, in geographies, whatever they may be, and then translating that into something that's useful for decision-making purposes is still in the works. There are some groups that are, making progress in that regard, but, I get asked the question every single day by the clients I advise in this space: give me the one-shot solution. And unfortunately now there's just no one-shot solution. Progress is being made, but again, patience is required, and there's a tremendous amount of availability out there. The one thing I will say is that there are advisors like CREtech who can actually create bespoke solutions that get to your particular business goals, economic goals, and social goals, all of that. Not just money, but community building and what you would like to do as well in that regard. Khushbu, did you have a comment?
Absolutely, and please.
Did you have a comment? No, okay, go ahead, Frank, sorry.
No, I think your point is spot on. And actually, one of my subsequent points here, I am going to speak to those emerging providers, the aggregators of aggregators, right, within commercial real estate, the data management firms that have expertise within commercial real estate, and they understand that fragmentation. So this isn't just isolated now to the sophisticated investors or operators that have the sheer manpower, research teams, bandwidth to do it. There are now providers in the marketplace that you can actually engage in partnership to accomplish that unification of data. The second point, inventory your current solution stack and your workflow. So your people process platform. So once you identify the critical data that you need to track and you need to store, you need to protect, and you want to integrate, understanding your reliances on P&L accounting softwares, on cash flow modeling software. How does the data flow? What is your team in the workflow processes? Where do you create that data? It's very important to understand the governance around it, the creation around it, the standardization around it. So it is worth taking the time to inventory that. Now, there's an operational benefit to that also. It isn't just the downstream benefit of the emerging tech. From an operations standpoint, it actually really baselines you to prepare for contract negotiations, for IP protection, for all of the things that if you try to do that retroactively without a comprehensive strategy, can be very difficult and time consuming.
Yeah.
Third recommendation. Develop and
Do we
implement
have
a data storage.
We're never going to get through 8.
We have 8. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll combine a couple here. So let's talk about let's talk about the integration, that collection and integration. So Minta, as you referenced, investors now can take stock of their own data. They now have more tools than ever to manage that data internally. So commodity tools, whether it's Azure, AWS, whatever it is, but there are also specialty firms within commercial real estate. So if the challenge of unifying data, dealing with all these disparate data sources, both traditional transaction and new emerging in the sentiment space and mobility space, if it seems overwhelming, there are specialty firms within commercial real estate now. They are maturing and they are very capable at helping to organize and structure that data. And so let's talk about some of the benefits of that. So I'll go to the last few points here, Minta, on recommendation. One is to exploit alternative crowdsourced and open data providers. So I think we all know there's an incumbency within commercial real estate where we're reliant on some of the survey companies, some of the subscription data providers, and there can be some limitations in that they don't represent the entire universe of our commercial real estate inventory. And also there can be some restrictions on data use. There are a lot of alternatives now, whether you're talking open data providers like New York City Open Data, crowdsourced, and we talk CompStack and other providers in the crowdsource space. So lots of alternatives to infill your data now and do that at either no cost or low cost. So would recommend definitely exploring and exploiting those alternative data sources. The other is geospatial, right? So bringing all of your data into a geospatial platform without even running statistical analysis, it immediately empowers and weaponizes your data, right? So you get to see patterns in markets. And if you have done the housekeeping of your own portfolio and your own data, you can overlay that. That is extremely informative. I know that we've all seen it in geointelligence platforms, geospatial platforms, the power of combining those data sets visually and identifying patterns and clustering. And then the final recommendation. Yes, please, Minta.
I was going to say that I think that, there's a very different level of sophistication within our audience about what all of this data is that's being discussed and how it can be managed. Suffice it to make a point that data is really powerful. Data can be a value enhancer. Data can really help you strategize about where you want to invest, where you want to be active, how you want to design buildings, where you want to make capital expenditures, where you don't, what you need to do to think about tenant retention and NOI stickiness. And we have clear experts, on the CREtech Innovation Consulting team, that can really help with that. So keep it in the back of your mind for those of you who are early to really thinking about this. And for those of you who are deep in the weeds, already talk to the CREtech Consulting team.
Yeah, and I think that's the last point, Minta, is really the starting point is a holistic strategy on where your data is created, making sure it's well-defined, well-structured, and it's collected. So even when we talk about the last point was really around the physical asset itself and the massive amount of data we're now creating with connected and smart building technology. It's just one more layer of complexity, but it's also opportunity. So if you start really with that data foundation, the CREtech team can help advise you. We can align you with some of our best-in-class partners in the ecosystem that can help you manage and really take advantage now of our movement from traditional trailing data that really drives analysis in our industry to more windshield, to more leading and predictive and prescriptive.
Thanks. Thank you, Frank. Okay, I'd like to shift the discussion a bit now to another component of what I said that we would talk about today, and that is forward-thinking design and forward-thinking community building. We can get down in the data deeply, and people should, to deal, to address bespoke solutions for them. But, there is a group of very forward-thinking leaders who have moved on to think about the way their communities should be shaped. And those communities can be broadly defined to be buildings. They can be blocks. They can be entire communities. They can be something else. And I'd like to ask Khushbu to share with us some of the work that he's doing now, shifting into multifamily, which is a different asset class, and I think a very, very important one to think about now, particularly taking into account the need for people to feel safe and be healthy mentally and physically.
Yeah, sure. Frank, that was absolutely fascinating, very complex stuff. And Marcio, I loved your chart on the hype cycle. When I think about hype and what is long-term, what will have the most long-term impact in multifamily, my perspective has always been to look at fundamental human needs and desires. And I think one of the overarching themes that has really emerged from this pandemic is around health and wellness, and not just COVID. It's really that the average adult gets sick 2 to 4 times a year. So there's infectious diseases all the time. And what are we doing in order to help prevent that? And I think that's a really important topic. And when I think about, as developers, what we try to do when we select a site or we build a mixed use asset, we're really trying to provide access to the tenants in that space, access to transportation hubs, access to convenience, access to lifestyle. And I think access to health is incredibly important. And when you look at technology, it's very horizontal, and it allows us to really converge different verticals. And I think there's this really powerful opportunity to converge health tech, which is also has accelerated a lot during this pandemic, with, of course, real estate tech. And I've taken this opportunity to do a lot of research, aside from looking at air quality, but also who can we partner with, as developers, and to create access to preventative healthcare. And there's a few companies that I've been talking to, one in particular that has created this physical space that combines health and wellness, both physically and digitally, to serve not only that specific community, but the larger neighborhood. And I think, just moving forward, that is going to be a really important topic and area to spend some time on.
Yeah, if I could, I'll just jump on top of that. So it's interesting you bring that up, because we're on access, and so my background being in the access control space, it's interesting to see that the use cases of which you all are talking about are starting to intersect into it. So things like data, access control forever has been somewhat of an isolated system, that it was actually built purposely that way because you didn't want really it to be open, because you wanted to keep bad people out. So it was always seen, if you integrated it into everything, it actually opened up the opportunity for something bad to happen. So it's historically been built isolated. And now, because of this use case, you're starting to see somewhat of a movement historically, primarily around mobile and the ability to use your phone to get in. And now, though, health sort of has, T-boned this idea of safety and convenience, and now we have to respond in a different way. But a lot of the systems that have been historically built were not built with this use case in mind. So they're having to sort of either rip and replace some older systems or some of the newer systems that are in place, being able to pivot a bit. You've seen within our industry this idea around frictionless and seamless, and now everyone's talking about touchless, for instance. That's how health has impacted. And then based off of that too is the need to collect data on who the people are. And these systems have not been thought through in a lot of ways of how you manage the data and how you express the data to other things. So getting a system like access control brought into the conversation to deliver, we've been saying, at least on my end, this idea of going from access control to access care without being too cute. But what that basically means is the idea that it can help increase health and wellness, and giving access to facilities done in a proper way, but then also not exposing it to other threats like HIPAA, for instance. I don't know many access control systems that worried about HIPAA, before, and now all of a sudden we're having to do so. So looking at the different trends of what you have and asking questions, my recommendation, asking questions of your providers that have historically been around safety, but starting to ask them questions about things like health and wellness are critically important.
So, Lee, as you work with your clients and you think about these issues all the time, on the health and wellness front, writ large, not just multifamily at this point, what are you seeing in terms of industry interest in an adoption around, temperature screening in one form or another, cameras or on-site checking? What are you seeing around landlords who have multi-tenant buildings that have some tenants who want screening and some tenants who don't?
Sure. So we're seeing a great increase, as you can imagine, because getting into places is now becoming a critical sort of choke point of sort of flow, and really being able to identify who the people are properly, and then being able to add data points, if you would, like temperature, for instance, to the yes or no, whether they're allowed to go into a place. Again, not a use case that was really thought of a lot before, and now all of a sudden having to be sort of in a pressure cooker shoved on top of, and so I'll speak to a couple of the technologies specifically, both on multifamily and regular commercial real estate, because visitor management in multifamily historically has been around intercom type systems or somebody at the front desk. Same idea in a lobby, different tenants, but theoretically the same idea. So the initial first rush that we've seen is around the thermal camera side of everything, whether it's fever detection or just temperature detection. And talk about hype cycle, that out of the gates went to the top, and I would like to believe it's all done off of all the right reasons, but we're starting to now see some pushback because actually things like false positives, the going through the conversation like, okay, now what? And this balance between security theater and actually security measures and how you do the two of them. There's a lot that you can actually learn from just watching how sort of the government responded to 9/11 at airports, and the balance between what security theater looks like and what security measures are, and you can apply them here. My recommendation from all the studies that are coming out now around the temperature and thermal is they're not really all cracked up to what they are, and they're not the panacea of solving all problems for allowing people to come in. Now, my personal opinion is they're a data point, and if they're utilized as a data point to make an informed decision, okay. If they're used as the end all be all to whether you're going to allow somebody to go to work or not, I don't recommend that. The industry isn't recommending it. But again, I think this is why it's important to have people that are working with you or even within your own that are educated on these subjects, because my fear is you're going to start to see headlines of the belief that I put these technologies in place, like pre-registration, which is a good one, and using visitor management systems, a very good one. But you put all these technologies in place, but yet the impact is not, or the return on the investment is not seen, and people actually can get sick from it because there's a sense that everything's okay when it's actually not.
It's interesting. We're working with a number of clients who are debating whether or not to deploy those kinds of systems. And there are clearly pros and cons. There are liability pros and cons as well in terms of what one may undertake. And some clients have a very strong desire, particularly in very large CBD high towers, to have a very large demonstration of control and attention. And others, with different asset classes and different spaces, have a different appetite for that.
Yeah,
So it's interesting.
again, I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm just saying you apply that. It's like, it's not everyone in our industry. We joke, we're like, who needs a hammer? Everyone's got a hammer. And it's like, as long as you have hammers there, everything's fine. And it's not. It's sort of the application of it and the expectations of what it's going to do is really got to be thought through, because there could be some massive downstream impacts. And I would suggest in the conversation that we've been having around this is try to think about, okay, so I've applied this technology. What now could go wrong? Because whether it's the societal impacts of marginalizing more marginalized people already, or the false sense of security and safety when it doesn't actually there, and you could spend, a lot of money on some of these cameras down to a little bit of money. It's just more about the application and thinking through the impacts of what it has.
Yep. It's interesting. I think there are cultural differences as well because, you know, we have offices in Hong Kong and outside the US, and the acceptance of this you know, kind of surveillance, if you will, or monitoring culturally is very different in different cultures. And, you know, I don't know where the US will go with it, and I don't know what the utility of it ultimately will be. But we do have clients who are struggling with whether to do it or not in the commercial space. Kushbu, have you seen it at all in the residential space? I would think not, but interested to hear.
Yeah, I think in the residential space, the challenge is really how do we ensure that the residents are complying with social gathering policies or social distancing policies that we have put in the building. And it's hard to rely on our on-site team. One, you know, just the general size of buildings you would need to monitor each space. So we do, you know, it's become more critical to rely on technology to gather that data and help use that to actually help control the spaces. So for us, I've been working with a company, a spatial analytics company that can, I think Marcio had mentioned this before, but they can actually track, you know, which portions of the room are being used, what objects are being used in the room, how many people are there, what the distance is between them. So then it could send real-time data back to your on-site team, and they can address it if there's an issue. But also they can use that technology to schedule their cleanings, like knowing that your cleaners have X amount of time on site, so scheduling them appropriately and making sure they're doing a deeper clean of one area of that amenity space versus another. And then also, you know, combining that technology so it's no longer just a point solution with your access control solution. So they're partnering with access control vendors. So then you can also lock down an amenity space if there are, you know, the maximum number of people there. And I think that one, it helps operationally because there has been a bit of a, you know, a struggle. It's really uncomfortable for the site team to go tell someone to leave a space or that they cannot enter. So that's really uncomfortable. And I think it's really uncomfortable for the resident too, to get to a place and you're looking inside a room, can I go in, can I not go in? So I think it helps solve for both of those things.
You know, that's interesting, Marcia, because you had on the mature side of your curve, IoT, which includes sensors and includes, you know, different IoT components and solutions, but it would be interesting to hear your views on the relevance or the importance, significance of that particular kind of technology for non-residential space.
Sure. Yeah, I think on the IoT space, Internet of Things, all the sensors, we're seeing, you know, like I said before, multiple versions now out, much more mature, and so certainly, you know, the ones that are kind of more interesting and having more appeal, the air quality side of it, I think is really important. That was something that was somewhat important to clients before, but now it's becoming extremely important. But honestly, I think we're seeing every one of these technologies trying to adapt to a new environment. And I just want to piggyback off of Kushba's comments there. We saw, for example, on the robotics front, all of a sudden this expansion of capabilities such as sanitization and then security robots that all of a sudden can take temperature to Lee's point. And then they can also kind of look at large gatherings and if folks are wearing masks and that kind of thing. So, you know, there's just kind of this proliferation of new ideas. And, you know, just about everything that I showed on that hype cycle is starting to morph and trying to figure out ways that they can contribute to helping out. So certainly I think the biggest advancements and you know, the biggest push has been on the robotics side because it's a mobile capability that can roam around, whether it's inside a building or outside. You know, but it's an interesting thing. It's a moving target. And I think all of us are trying to say, look, there's a lot of great ideas. You really want to pilot these things, test them out before introducing them too quickly because, you know, there's a lot of room for error as well. So I think that's the cautionary tale is, while technology can be a great solution, it's important to have this, a data strategy. We often are talking to clients that are, well, how can I deploy AI to have this predictive maintenance? And really the answer is, let's start with the data side, because honestly, it might take a couple of years to get to a place where you can take advantage of these technologies. So I think what we're trying to articulate is the foundational points that you can then start to take advantage, and then be a little bit skeptical of all the sales pitches that you're getting. Ideally, if you can have a neutral party like CREtech that can actually help to distill some of that, that's also helpful. But it's important to evaluate and pilot and really dig in, and not get sold necessarily on the promise, because there's going to be a lot of changes moving forward.
That leads me to ask, if I could ask each of you who has a lot of learning gone into this, a lot of thinking about it, a lot more than most of us do. If you had to pick 3 things, if you were advising a commercial real estate owner, be agnostic as to asset class for a minute, be agnostic as to geography, what would you advise them as they're trying to get their arms around this whole tech cycle and this whole future proofing to look at? So Lee, let me start with you. What would be the 3 most important things for a client to start with?
Yeah. So number one, I would advise having somebody internally, and I'll speak specifically to the access control on the visitor management side, security end. I would have somebody take ownership of it internally in the organization, to be sort of an internal expert that could work through the different. What we find is typically our industry is left to maybe the security department, or they outsource it. So I would recommend, number one, having somebody now, and really think of it beyond the security side of what it is. But when you do that, it starts to expand more of how it can add value. Number 2 is, I would take an inventory of what you currently have in the systems. And in our case, our industry's products were built to last for 30 years. That was the intent. So they go in the basement. You never think about them unless something bad happens, which hopefully nothing does. And then you really, if nothing's bad happened in 30 years, it must be fine. But a lot's evolved since then, and a lot of the use cases for today are not there. So I would do a real good inventory of exactly what we have. And then the third one is I would take a look at my systems to make sure that they're set up to be able to work with others, because I don't believe that there's going to be one single one. And I bring that up, and it seems simple, but in the industry that we're in the access control side, like I said before, they were historically built to be isolated by themselves. It doesn't need to be that anyway. So you have APIs, you've got great ways to integrate them into the different systems. They can provide input back out. They can do a whole lot now. And I would not take the advice that you hear from a lot of people within our industry that says, hey, isolate this thing so there's nothing bad that could happen. Those would be my 3 that I would recommend that you do.
Very valuable. Thanks, Frank.
So my top 3 would be where I started: develop an organizational data strategy. I think that that's essential to having a playbook. I think, Lee brought up a couple points, Khushbu did, where the new technologies are creating data exhaust, and you have to understand that data exhaust both risk and opportunity. So I think even non-sophisticated investors need to have a fundamental data strategy. You need to understand what you should be collecting and how it moves through your cycle. The second is, and Lee brought this up, and I think it's a great point, with each new technology deployment, I would ask the question, what could go wrong? So, Khushbu brought up the example of all the great operational benefit you can get in the multifamily space on the back of data now, on tenant satisfaction data, occupancy density monitoring. There's a flip side to that, and there's a danger with PII, and like Lee said, making decisions that are now at the individual level that actually could increase your risk and liability. So I think that asking that fundamental question with each deployment of new tech, what could go wrong, is a great risk management tool. And then I would echo also the interoperability between systems. I think we're seeing an organic move towards more open systems. A lot of the next up startups are starting out API enabled. They're starting out with API Swagger documentation to understand their data libraries and how you map to that data. That is going to be essential. All of these systems are converging, and the data between them, you're going to need to be able to structure and organize that data. So I would demand transparency from your solution providers and the data that moves through their systems, and ensure that you have interoperability, whether that's API integration or at least fundamental export of that key data.
Couldn't agree with that more. We work with a lot of clients who are struggling with each of those issues. The privacy issues are real. The API connectivity is very, very real and can impact performance and satisfaction with any particular solution. So validate those recommendations completely. Marcio.
Thank you. I'm going to answer that question purely from a technology perspective, those three that I think are most relevant. And certainly I think the big question is, how do we make these buildings smarter, right? So I think that progression and in this order, I would go with obviously Internet of Things and the sensors that are much more mature that you can start to deploy. But obviously take a look at what you already have. Just the sheer number of sensors in a building is also potentially overwhelming. It's something that you have to watch for, each of these things generating tons and tons of data. So again, back to that data strategy and making sure you have one. But certainly in a progression of a smart building, the IoT capabilities are going to greatly enhance it. Further down the line, I would look at digital twin as a great way to kind of, it's a topic unto itself, but really, it's a way to model what is happening in the building. So taking all that data that you're generating in real time and figuring out different what if scenarios, like what if this happens, or if there's a hurricane, and those kinds of things. You can use a digital twin, a digital version of that building to begin to examine the possibilities and how to prepare for it. And then layer that on top with artificial intelligence. And that those, if you've gotten to that point where you can actually create a digital twin, now you have the data that you can start to look at those algorithms. So there's the what if scenarios in the digital twin, and then all of the other things that perhaps you're not thinking about that you want AI to start to point out, so that there's some issue here that you need to look at. So I think in that order, IoT, digital twin, artificial intelligence would be my recommendation for a progression to truly get to smart buildings.
For those of the audience who don't understand what a digital twin is, why don't you just give 10 seconds on that, please?
Yeah, I think the best example, this is something that GE used quite a bit, and it's a technology that's a little bit more mature on that side, and it's kind of new to commercial real estate. But so if you think about how GE has to pilot or evaluate jet engines, a very complicated piece of machine. And obviously, if you're trying to test something on the actual physical engine, there's a lot can go wrong. So what they initially developed was a digital version of it. So think the CAD drawings and so forth, but where the data, there's real data being fed into it from the physical object. And that it's a very good way to emulate all the different scenarios and so forth. And we're, that makes perfect sense when you're testing jet engines, but it's starting to make a lot of sense for buildings, because the sheer amount of data that's being generated by any sizable building is pretty significant. And you need to be able to look at that and comprehensively see what is happening. And just looking at an individual sensor or dashboard of, okay, I can see occupancy, then you have to hop over to someplace else to see air quality or anything else. That's the world that we're at today. Fast forward into the next couple of years, digital twin is a great way to bring all that together visually and allow you to look at your building holistically, again, to be able to run scenarios, to be able to understand patterns and things that, that you would never necessarily be able to do. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
We work with a lot of clients who are investing in this technology because it provides extraordinary preventive cost maintenance savings, and it also is extremely instructive in construction processes. Absolutely. So that firms who are engaged in development and design can see what's gone well and what's gone not well, across their projects and their portfolios. I think it's a fascinating technology.
And Minta, just one little quick point, because you brought up the construction. I think most folks that are coming from that environment know about BIM. BIM's been around forever. Building information modeling, it's something that's supposed to be developed for every building that's being built. So think of digital twin as kind of BIM on steroids, if you will. So kind of the next version of it. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
I mean, it's pretty cool to look at when you see actually what a digital twin of your asset looks like. It's amazing. Khushbu.
Yeah, I'm basically going to reiterate all of the great things the panelists say. I think it all goes into being able to transform our built environments into these dynamic technology platforms. And for me, something Lee said about taking access control and beyond security was really important when we were looking at this initiative. Even a couple of years ago, it started out with the phone in the pocket is really about convenience, and then it can lead to more efficient leasing practices because you can allow for self-guided tours, and then it can also allow for the layering of different uses of real estate. You could add home sharing, you could add short-term rentals, and you need a more fluid access control system to allow for that and allow for it efficiently. And then with IoT and data, it just allows us to make so much more intelligent decisions about not only how we're operating our buildings today, but for future development. So again, back to spatial analytics, the reason we found it so fascinating is because it provides us hopefully anonymous PII data, so it doesn't violate any laws, but it allows us to understand how spaces are being used and what spaces we need to develop for the next project. And that data does take a couple years to collect and analyze and make sure that you're seeing true patterns in it. And then third, again, to reiterate what I said about health, I think the access to health will be really important. And I don't think as an industry, we could be controlling that space, but it's more about facilitating preventative health care and getting, creating these powerful partnerships and collaborations with technology in that sector to really go to the core fundamental of what we need as humans.
I'd like to ask you to comment on that just a bit more, because I think it's extraordinarily important for our audience to understand that we're not just talking pure tech here around operations, design, and construction, but we're talking community building. And, I would welcome your comments and your thoughts based on, your area of work right now around how you see different shapes for communities and how you see different attributes of them being offered to residents and occupants on a generalized basis.
Yeah, I think one of the things is, with a partnership like this, you start thinking about the community from the outside in, the public spaces, how you're designing that, what you're doing in order to encourage mental and social health, and then also providing the resources, again, not only to that specific community, but to the neighborhood, a place where people can come and get all of their needs met when it comes to their health and comes to wellness. I mean, it's a really deep area to study, so probably for another webinar, but I think that there is a lot there, and Well just released their new standards around all of this, and a new certification program as well for multifamily and all commercial real estate buildings. So that's also something really interesting to look into.
Yeah, definitely beyond the scope of today, but I think something that all of our audience should be thinking about, because once we get beyond the COVID-19 imminent control issues, then there will definitely be a look, I believe, in the industry to reshaping the way we're thinking about the use of a hardscape. And I think some of the work you're doing in that area will be very relevant together with others, going forward.
Yeah, Minta, if I could on sort of how we're applying it in the access control space, because I think it's an interesting an area, again, that's intended to keep bad people out and create barriers and more or less try to separate people. That's like the essence of what our industry is forever done because it delivers safety. The more we can do that, and we've started to have conversations around the need on the health and wellness of our systems, because now if our systems are, first of all, starting to go outside the building, when historically they've always been about once you get into the building, the relationship of how you treat data and treat people and communicate to them matters. So as somebody's coming up to the building, ways to, if you're using visitor management systems now in order to welcome people to the space, but then also collect data, they're properly being able to do that and do it in a way that has more care to it than versus a control, because there's a fine line where people, the creepy factor increases heavily when you start asking questions about people personally, like, is anybody in your house been sick? Which we've seen some applications and things like that come out to do that. It starts to bridge when somebody's there just, to drop off a file. It's sort of like, do I need to let you know what's going on in my house? And then if my job is to drop this file off to you, but then I can't get in there because somebody was sick in my house, like there's this weird dynamic that the access control systems have to, and visitor management have to get better at how to communicate with the end user, because it's gonna create, and what my belief is, if you're watching right now, like what's going on in Major League Baseball, I think that it's a great place for the built environment to take a look at somebody who's trying to go back to work currently right now. And in reading a bunch of the data and the feedback that you're hearing from people, one of the biggest drivers of what is creating in the health and wellness side, I think, anxiety, is the inconsistencies that these systems that they put in place are driving. So people, that either it's too much information, not enough information, sometimes they get stuff, sometimes they don't. And on the access control side, we're starting to try to create a conversation. And when you're looking at partners, there's ones that get this, so that have put systems in place to help deliver those consistencies. Because what we don't want to do is maybe keep people safe physically, but mentally wear them out. And there are systems and people in our industry that understand the end user, and it's not just about the integrator or the panel and all the other stuff that we used to do before, that I do think is important to start having those conversations. Like I haven't seen many RFPs, again, to be fair, it's soon, but RFPs that start to have those types of conversations when you're making selections of who your partners are. And I think it's going to become more important.
I think that's an excellent point. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I will say that the complexity in this area is obvious by virtue of the discussion today. The need for nuance is obvious. The fact that one size does not fit all is very, very obvious. So for those of you who are struggling with some of these issues or thinking about what to do or what not to do, which is almost, as important, or, how to shape this or how to shape that, where to spend your money, where not to spend your money, how to address short-term risks, how to address long-term risks. So lots of complicated questions, and they're different, and there are all different kinds of, voices that you can hear to inform your thinking around them. So, CREtech has a consulting team now that is exciting and highly experienced and global, for those of you who've dialed in from around the globe. But these are very, very, very important issues that are not easy to solve. And so they require a lot of thought, and they require a lot of discussion. And, business owners and others have to take into account what their particular goals are across the range of economic, social, etc. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their participation today. I think we have more questions coming out of this panel than we have answers, but therein lies a provocative conversation. And I know that any of us would be happy to talk with you. I know Michael Beckerman would be happy to talk with any of you with any follow-on you would like. Thanks.
Everybody.